The trap snapped shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the frozen wilderness, and Sarah Ward knew she had made a terrible mistake. Blood seeped through her torn skirt as she knelt in the snow, her trembling hands reaching toward the steel jaws that held her ankle captive. The wind howled through the pine trees above, carrying with it the scent of approaching storm and something else, something that made her skin crawl with fear. Footsteps crunched through the snow behind her, deliberate and unhurried, and she closed her eyes knowing that her desperate gamble had led her straight into the hands of the very man she had hoped to escape. Paul Gonzalez emerged from the tree line like a shadow-given form, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. His dark eyes took in the scene before him, the trapped woman, the blood in the snow, the terror written across her features. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply stood there studying her with the same calculating gaze he might use to assess a wounded animal. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps, creating small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. She had heard the stories about this man, whispered warnings from the women in town about the trapper who lived alone in the mountains, who showed no mercy to those who trespassed on his land. The steel trap bit deeper into her flesh as she struggled, and a cry of pain escaped her lips before she could stop it. Paul moved then, stepping closer with the fluid grace of a predator approaching its prey. His boots left deep impressions in the snow as he circled around to face her, his expression still giving nothing away. Sarah pressed her back against the rough bark of a pine tree, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for him to speak, to reveal what fate he had planned for her. But before we see how this desperate encounter unfolds, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let me take you back to where this story truly began, 3 weeks earlier, when Sarah Ward first set foot in the mountain town of Cedar Ridge with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperate hope. The stagecoach had lurched to a stop outside the general store, and Sarah had climbed down on unsteady legs, her few possessions clutched in a worn carpet bag. The November wind cut through her thin coat like a blade, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she surveyed the small cluster of buildings that made up the town. Cedar Ridge was nothing like the bustling city she had left behind. Nothing like the life she had known before her husband's death had stripped away everything she thought was secure. The telegram crumpled in her coat pocket contained the last of her hope, a job offer from a family named the Phillips, who needed a housekeeper for their ranch outside of town. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and more importantly, it was far enough away from Boston that the creditors and the shame of her husband's debts couldn't follow her. She had sold everything she owned to pay for the journey west, leaving behind the grave of the only man she had ever loved and the ruins of a life that had once seemed so promising. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, grateful for the warmth that enveloped her. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. This was Brenda Torres, the storekeeper's wife, though Sarah didn't know it yet. The woman looked up from her ledger and offered a welcoming smile that was the first genuine warmth Sarah had encountered in weeks. "You must be the new girl the Phillips family was expecting," Brenda said, coming around the counter to greet her. "I'm Brenda Torres. My husband Christopher and I run this place. You look half frozen, dear. Let me get you some coffee while we wait for Ronald Phillips to come collect you." Sarah accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her numb fingers around its warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Torres. I'm Sarah Ward. I hope I haven't kept Mr. Phillips waiting. The stage was delayed by the weather." Brenda's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features that Sarah was too tired and cold to notice. "Oh, honey, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Ronald Phillips died 2 weeks ago. Heart gave out while he was working the cattle. His wife, Nancy, took the children back east to live with her sister. There's no job waiting for you here." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she had to grip the counter to keep from swaying. The coffee cup trembled in her hands as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She was stranded in a strange town with no money, no prospects, and winter closing in around the mountains like a fist. The last of her savings had gone to pay for the stagecoach ticket, and she had burned her bridges back east so thoroughly that there was no possibility of return. "I see," she managed to whisper, though her voice sounded hollow and distant to her own ears. "I understand. Thank you for telling me." Brenda's face creased with concern as she studied Sarah's pale features. Now don't you go looking like that, dear. We'll figure something out. There's always work to be found if you're willing to do it, and you look like a woman who's not afraid of hard work. But even as Brenda spoke the reassuring words, both women knew the truth. Winter jobs were scarce in a town like Cedar Ridge, especially for a woman with no connections and no references. The other shopkeepers had their own families to worry about, and the few wealthy families in the area had long since made their arrangements for domestic help. Sarah found herself facing the very real possibility of starving or freezing to death before the spring thaw came. That first night, Brenda and Christopher Torres took pity on her and allowed her to sleep in the small room above their store. Sarah lay awake on the narrow cot, listening to the wind rattle the windows and trying not to think about the future that stretched before her like an endless void. She had been so certain that coming west would solve her problems, that distance and hard work could somehow erase the pain of loss and the humiliation of poverty. Now she realized how naive that hope had been. The next morning brought fresh snow and fresh disappointment. Sarah spent the day walking from business to business, asking about work and being turned away with varying degrees of politeness. The banker, Jeffrey Reyes, barely looked up from his papers when she inquired about a position. The hotel owner, George Brooks, explained that he had no need for additional staff during the slow winter months. Even the local seamstress, Lisa Taylor, could offer nothing more than sympathy and a cup of tea. By the end of the week, Sarah's situation had grown desperate. The Torres family had been kind, but she could see the strain her presence was putting on their modest resources. Their own children needed food and warmth, and Sarah refused to be a burden on people who had already shown her such generosity. She began skipping meals, claiming she wasn't hungry, and spending her days walking the frozen streets in search of any opportunity, no matter how small. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that she first heard the name Paul Gonzalez spoken in hushed, fearful tones. She had been standing outside the saloon, not because she had any business there, but because the warmth from within seeped through the gaps in the walls and offered momentary relief from the cold. Through the thin wood, she could hear the conversation of the men inside, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Saw him in town yesterday," one voice was saying. "Looked like he hadn't seen civilization in months. Beard down to his chest and eyes like a wolf's. Makes my skin crawl just thinking about him up there in those mountains all alone. They say he's got more furs stockpiled than any 3 trappers combined," another voice replied. "Must be making a fortune. But what good does money do a man who never spends it? Lives like a hermit. Barely speaks to anyone when he does come down to trade. My wife heard from Brenda Torres that he's looking for someone to help with the domestic work at his cabin," a third voice chimed in. "Can you imagine? What kind of woman would be desperate enough to work for a man like that?" Sarah's heart had begun to race as she listened to the conversation. A job, any job, was more than she had been able to find anywhere else in town. She pressed closer to the wall, straining to hear more details about this mysterious Paul Gonzalez and the work he might offer. "Brenda mentioned it to my Nancy," the first voice continued. "Said he came into the store asking about hiring help. Offered good wages too, but nobody's fool enough to send their daughter or wife up to that godforsaken cabin. Man's been alone too long. No telling what he might do to a woman up there with no one to hear her scream." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. Yet even as fear gripped her heart, a desperate part of her mind was already calculating the possibilities. Good wages meant the chance to survive the winter, maybe even save enough to start over somewhere else come spring. And what other choice did she have? The alternative was slow starvation or throwing herself on the charity of people who could barely afford to help her. That night she lay awake again, but this time her sleeplessness was caused by more than just worry. She was weighing options. None of them good, all of them dangerous in their own way. By morning, her decision was made. She would ask Brenda Torres for more information about Paul Gonzalez and his offer of work. It might be walking into the jaws of a trap, but at least it was walking towards something, rather than simply waiting to die. Brenda's reaction when Sarah brought up the subject was everything she had feared it would be. The older woman's face went pale, and she immediately began shaking her head, before Sarah had even finished asking her question. Absolutely not, Brenda said firmly. I won't be responsible for sending you up to that man's cabin. Paul Gonzalez is not someone you want to tangle with, dear. He's been living alone in those mountains for near on 10 years now, and solitude does things to a man's mind, changes him in ways that aren't natural. But you said he was offering good wages, Sarah pressed, her desperation making her bolder than she would normally be. Mrs. Torres, I'm grateful for your kindness, but I can't continue to impose on your family. I need work, and if this man is willing to pay fairly for honest labor, then perhaps it's worth considering. Brenda studied her for a long moment, taking in the hollow look in Sarah's eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame from the meal she had been skipping. Finally, she sighed and shook her head again, though this time with resignation rather than refusal. The man came in here 3 days ago looking like something that had crawled out of the wilderness, she said quietly, bought supplies enough for 2 people through the winter, and asked if I knew of any woman who might be willing to work as a housekeeper. Said he'd pay $30 a month plus room and board, which is more than generous by any standard. But Sarah, honey, there's a reason no one has taken him up on that offer. $30 a month was indeed generous, more than Sarah had dared to hope for. It was enough to not only survive but to save money for a new start somewhere else. The amount was so far beyond what she had expected that it almost seemed too good to be true, which only reinforced her suspicion that there was something very wrong with the situation. What exactly do people say about him? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I mean, beyond the fact that he lives alone and keeps to himself. Has he actually done anything to harm anyone? Brenda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. It's not what he's done exactly. It's more what he might do. A man who cuts himself off from human contact the way he has, well, it's not natural. And the way he looks at people when he does come to town, like he's sizing them up for something, makes folks nervous. But no actual incidents of violence or impropriety? Well, no, Brenda admitted reluctantly, but that doesn't mean you should ignore your instincts, dear. Sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence enough when it comes to protecting yourself. Sarah understood the wisdom in Brenda's words, but wisdom was a luxury she could no longer afford. That evening, she made her decision. She would find a way to contact Paul Gonzalez and offer her services as a housekeeper. It was a gamble with stakes she didn't want to consider, but it was the only chance she had left. The next morning, she asked Christopher Torres for directions to Paul Gonzalez's cabin. The storekeeper's reaction was even more alarmed than his wife's had been, but eventually he provided her with basic directions to the trapper's remote dwelling. It was a day's hard walk into the mountains, following a trail that was barely more than a deer path for most of its length. Christopher warned her that the weather could turn deadly without warning, and that she would be completely cut off from help if anything went wrong. Despite all the warnings and her own growing fear, Sarah set out early the next morning, with her few belongings packed in her carpet bag and what little food the Torres family could spare wrapped in a cloth bundle. The trail was even more treacherous than Christopher had warned, winding through dense forest and over rocky terrain that grew increasingly difficult as she climbed higher into the mountains. The first few miles weren't too challenging, following a relatively well-worn path that showed signs of occasional use. But as she climbed higher, the trail became fainter, sometimes disappearing entirely for stretches that left her guessing at the correct direction. The trees grew thicker and taller, blocking out much of the weak winter sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight that made every shadow seem menacing. By midday, Sarah was exhausted and beginning to question the wisdom of her decision. Her thin boots were soaked through from the snow, and her feet had gone numb with cold. The bundle of food felt impossibly heavy, though it contained barely enough for 2 meals. She had been walking for hours and still saw no sign of human habitation, no smoke rising above the trees to indicate that she was getting close to her destination. It was then that she made her first serious mistake. Coming to a fork in the trail, she chose what seemed like the more traveled path, reasoning that it was more likely to lead to a dwelling. In reality, she had taken a hunting trail that would lead her deeper into the wilderness and away from Paul Gonzalez's cabin. By the time she realized her error, the sun was already beginning to set, and she was hopelessly lost in country that could kill her before morning. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell, and Sarah found herself stumbling through increasingly deep snow with no shelter in sight. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps as the cold air seared her lungs, and her hands had grown so numb that she could barely maintain her grip on her carpet bag. Every step was an effort, and she began to realize that she might not survive the night if she couldn't find some form of protection from the elements. It was pure desperation that drove her to continue moving rather than stopping to rest. She knew that sitting down in the snow might mean never getting up again, so she forced herself to keep walking, even as her legs trembled with exhaustion. The forest around her seemed alive with menacing sounds, the crack of branches in the wind, the distant howl of what might have been wolves, the whisper of snow falling from overloaded pine boughs. Then, just when she thought she could go no further, she saw it. A thin line of what looked like wire stretched between two trees, barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Her tired mind didn't immediately recognize what it was, and she stepped forward without thinking, her foot coming down on a concealed metal plate that triggered the mechanism with a sound like thunder in the quiet forest. The trap snapped shut with brutal efficiency, its steel jaws closing around her ankle, with enough force to drive her to her knees in the snow. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that seemed to shoot up her leg and through her entire body. She cried out, the sound echoing through the trees and startling a flock of birds from their roosts overhead. Blood began to seep through her torn stocking and the fabric of her skirt, dark stains spreading across the white snow beneath her. She reached for the trap with shaking hands, trying to find some way to release the mechanism, but the steel was slick with ice, and her fingers were too numb to get a proper grip. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured leg, and she could feel herself growing lightheaded from the shock and blood loss. That was when she heard the footsteps approaching through the snow, deliberate and unhurried, as if whoever was coming had been expecting to find exactly what they found. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins as she realized that the trap had been set deliberately, that someone had been hunting in these woods, and she had walked directly into their snare. The story she had heard about Paul Gonzalez came flooding back to her, all the warnings about what kind of man would live alone in the wilderness, all the fears about what he might do to a woman who found herself completely at his mercy. Paul Gonzalez emerged from the tree line like a shadow given form, moving with the silent grace of a predator in its natural element. He was exactly as the townspeople had described him, tall and lean with a wild beard, and eyes that seemed to catch and reflect the moonlight like an animal's. His clothes were rough, homespun, and leather, practical garments designed for survival rather than appearance. In his hands, he carried a rifle that looked well used and carefully maintained. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, studying the scene before him with those unsettling pale eyes. Sarah could feel his gaze taking in every detail, her torn clothing, the blood in the snow, the fear written across her features. She tried to speak, to explain what had brought her to his territory, but her voice caught in her throat and came out as little more than a whisper. "Please," she finally managed to say, "I was looking for you. I came about the work." Paul's expression didn't change as he processed her words. He moved closer, circling around to get a better view of the trapped woman, his boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. Up close, Sarah could see that his face was weathered by years of exposure to the elements, lined and scarred in ways that spoke of a hard life lived without comfort or companionship. But his eyes, those pale, unsettling eyes, held an intelligence that was both sharp and calculating. "You came about the work," he repeated, his voice rough from disuse but not unkind. "And you thought walking into my trap line in the dark was the best way to announce yourself?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. "I got lost. I took the wrong path, and I've been walking since morning. I didn't know about the traps." He studied her for another long moment, then set his rifle aside and knelt in the snow beside the trap. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he examined the mechanism, checking the extent of her injury without actually touching her. Sarah could smell him now, the scent of wood smoke and animal fur, and something else that was distinctly masculine and not altogether unpleasant. "This is going to hurt," he said matter-of-factly, positioning his hands on either side of the trap's jaws. But I need to get it open before the metal freezes to your skin. Sarah braced herself against the tree trunk and nodded, not trusting her voice. Paul's movements were swift and sure as he worked the release mechanism, and the trap opened with a metallic snap that made her flinch. The relief was immediate, though the pain remained intense as blood began to flow more freely from the puncture wounds. Paul examined her ankle with the same detached professionalism he had shown in opening the trap. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-hardened hands, and Sarah found herself studying his face as he worked. There was something about his manner that didn't match the fearsome reputation the townspeople had given him. He seemed more like a doctor or a veterinarian examining an injured animal, concerned with the practical aspects of treatment rather than any darker intentions. "Can you walk?" he asked, sitting back on his heels. Sarah tried to put weight on the injured foot and immediately gasped in pain. "I don't think so. Not far, anyway." Paul nodded as if he had expected this answer. Without asking permission, he scooped her up in his arms, lifting her as easily as if she weighed no more than a child. Sarah's first instinct was to struggle, but she quickly realized how futile that would be. She was completely dependent on his goodwill now, injured and lost in country that would kill her before dawn if he chose to abandon her. "My cabin is about a mile from here," he said, adjusting his grip to carry her more comfortably. "We'll get that ankle looked at properly, and then we can discuss this work you mentioned." The journey to his cabin passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as Paul carried her through the forest, following paths that were invisible to her, but which he seemed to know by heart. She was dimly aware of the rhythm of his breathing, the steady thud of his boots in the snow, the warmth radiating from his body in the frigid air. When she next became fully aware of her surroundings, she found herself lying on a rough wooden table in what appeared to be a one-room cabin. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, filling the space with warmth and flickering light. Paul was moving around the room with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies from various shelves and containers. The cabin was larger than she had expected, though still quite modest by any civilized standard. The walls were made of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the wind. Animal pelts hung from pegs and rafters, some still in the process of being prepared for market. A simple bed occupied one corner, while a small kitchen area took up another. Everything was clean and well organized, though clearly the domain of a man who had been living alone for a very long time. Paul returned to the table carrying a basin of water, clean cloth, and what appeared to be a bottle of whiskey. He set these items down and began cleaning the blood from her ankle with the same methodical care he had shown earlier. The water was warm, and Sarah realized he must have heated it while she was unconscious. "This is going to sting," he warned, uncorking the whiskey bottle. Sarah gripped the edges of the table and bit down hard on her lower lip as he poured the alcohol over the puncture wounds. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she managed not to cry out. Paul worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging the injury with practiced skill. "You'll live," he said when he was finished, "but you'll be off that foot for at least a week, maybe more. The trap didn't hit bone, but it tore up the muscle pretty good." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ankle. "Mr. Gonzalez, I want to thank you for helping me. I know you had no obligation to do so, especially considering how I ended up in your trap." He looked at her with those pale eyes, and for the first time, she thought she detected a hint of amusement in his expression. "You said you came about work. What kind of work were you thinking of?" "Housekeeping," Sarah said, gesturing around the cabin. "I heard in town that you were looking for someone to help with domestic duties, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." Paul was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "And what would make a woman desperate enough to come looking for work from someone like me?" The question was asked without malice, but Sarah felt the weight of it nonetheless. She could lie, make up some story about seeking adventure or preferring the solitude of mountain life, but something about his direct manner made her want to be equally honest in return. "I'm a widow," she said simply. "My husband died and left me with debts I couldn't pay. I came west hoping to find work with the Phillips family, but when I arrived I learned that Mr. Phillips had died and there was no position available. I've spent the last 2 weeks looking for any kind of employment, and yours was the only offer I could find." "So you're desperate," Paul said, not unkindly. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I'm desperate. He nodded slowly as if this explanation satisfied him in some way. The work isn't easy. This cabin needs a woman's touch. That's true enough, but it's not like keeping house in town. Everything has to be done by hand. Water carried from the stream, wood chopped for the fire, food prepared from whatever I can hunt or trap, and we'd be cut off from civilization until the spring thaw. I understand, Sarah said. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Gonzalez, and I have nowhere else to go. Paul moved to the window and stood looking out at the snow-covered landscape, his hands clasped behind his back. In the firelight, his profile was sharp and angular, like something carved from the mountain stone itself. Sarah waited, hardly daring to breathe, as he considered her proposition. $30 a month, he said finally, not turning from the window. Plus room and board. You'll have your own space partitioned off from the main room, and I'll respect your privacy. But I need to know that you can handle the isolation. Some people, they go a little crazy when they're cut off from other folks for too long. I think I can manage, Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely certain of that herself. When would you want me to start? You already have, Paul said, turning back to face her. That ankle's going to keep you laid up for a while anyway, so you might as well be laid up here as anywhere else. Consider it a trial period for both of us. Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had found work, shelter, and safety, at least for the immediate future. Whatever Paul Gonzalez's reputation might be in town, he had shown her nothing but kindness since finding her in his trap. Perhaps the stories were exaggerated, born of fear and misunderstanding, rather than any real evidence of wrongdoing. The next few days passed quietly as Sarah recovered from her injury and began to learn the routines of Paul's isolated existence. He was gone for long hours each day, checking his trap lines and hunting for game. When he returned, he would skin and prepare whatever animals he had caught, working with a skill and efficiency that spoke of years of practice. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, cleaning his weapons or working on various repair projects around the cabin. Sarah found herself studying him during these quiet moments, trying to reconcile the man she was coming to know with the fearsome reputation that preceded him. He was certainly taciturn, speaking only when necessary, and often going hours without saying a word. But his silence didn't feel threatening or hostile. It was more like the comfortable quiet of someone who had grown accustomed to solitude and saw no need to fill every moment with conversation. As her ankle began to heal, Sarah started taking on more of the domestic duties around the cabin. She prepared meals from the supplies Paul brought back from his hunting expeditions, learning to cook over an open fire and to make do with whatever ingredients were available. She swept and organized the living space, mended tiers in clothing and equipment, and gradually began to understand the rhythm of life in the wilderness. It was during her second week at the cabin that she first encountered Christopher Sanders, Paul's nearest neighbor and the only other person living within a day's walk of their remote location. Christopher was a grizzled old prospector who had been working a small gold claim in the area for the better part of 20 years. He appeared at their door one evening, seeking shelter from a sudden blizzard that had blown in from the north. Paul welcomed the older man with genuine warmth, the first real emotion Sarah had seen him display since her arrival. The two men clearly had a long-standing friendship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of those who had chosen to live apart from civilization. Over dinner, Christopher regaled them with stories of his prospecting adventures and the various characters he had encountered in his years in the mountains. It was Christopher who first mentioned the trouble that was brewing in the valley below. A group of men had been asking questions in town about Paul's activities, claiming to represent some kind of territorial authority. They were led by a man named Ronald Phillips, who Sarah realized with a start must be related to the family she had originally come west to work for. This Ronald Phillips, Sarah said carefully, is he related to the rancher who died recently? I was supposed to work for a Phillips family before I came here. Christopher nodded grimly. That would be his brother. Ronald's the black sheep of that family, been in and out of trouble with the law for years. Word is he's claiming that Paul here has been poaching on government land and trapping out of season. Says he's got the authority to confiscate all the furs and equipment. Paul's expression had grown dark during this recitation, and Sarah could see the tension building in his shoulders. Ronald Phillips has no authority over anything, he said quietly. and he knows it. This is about something else entirely. What kind of something else? Sarah asked, though she had a growing suspicion that she already knew the answer. It was Christopher who explained, his weathered face grave in the firelight. There's been talk for years about the mineral rights to this part of the mountains. Some folks think there might be silver or copper deposits up here, maybe even gold. If that's true, then the land becomes a lot more valuable than it is just for trapping and hunting. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. She was beginning to understand that her arrival at Paul's cabin had coincided with the beginning of a conflict that could destroy everything he had built in his years of solitude. The timing was too convenient to be mere coincidence, and she wondered if her presence here might somehow be connected to Ronald Phillips' sudden interest in Paul's activities. "Mr. Gonzalez," she said hesitantly, "do you think it's possible that my coming here was somehow part of a larger plan? That someone might have arranged for me to end up at your cabin?" Paul studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him considering the possibility. "It's crossed my mind," he admitted. "The job offer that brought you west, the timing of your arrival, even the fact that you got lost and ended up in my trap line. It could all be coincidence, but I've learned not to trust coincidences when there's money involved." The implications of what he was suggesting made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. If she had been used as an unwitting pawn in some scheme against Paul, then her presence here wasn't just putting her own life at risk, it was endangering the man who had shown her kindness when she desperately needed it. Christopher left the next morning when the storm cleared, but not before warning Paul to be extra cautious in the coming weeks. The old prospector had heard rumors that Ronald Phillips was planning some kind of action before the spring thaw, when travel in the mountains would become easier and Paul might have more opportunities to escape or seek help from outside authorities. Alone again with Paul, Sarah found herself torn between guilt over her possible role in bringing danger to his doorstep and a growing admiration for the way he faced the threat with calm determination. He didn't blame her for the situation, didn't treat her with suspicion or hostility, despite the questions surrounding her arrival. Instead, he simply began making preparations for whatever might come, checking his weapons and supplies with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had faced danger before. It was on a gray morning in early December that Ronald Phillips and his men finally made their move. Sarah was hanging laundry on a line strung between two pine trees when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the forest. Paul emerged from the cabin immediately, his rifle in his hands and his face set in hard lines that she had never seen before. The group that rode into the clearing consisted of 5 men, all armed and wearing the rough clothing of men who made their living through intimidation rather than honest work. Ronald Phillips was easy to identify as their leader, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a sneer. He bore little resemblance to the respectable rancher family that Sarah had originally planned to work for, and she realized that Christopher Sanders had been right about him being the black sheep of the Phillips clan. "Paul Gonzalez," Ronald called out, not bothering to dismount from his horse. "I'm here on behalf of the territorial government to investigate reports of illegal trapping and poaching on federal land. You're going to need to come with us for questioning." Paul's grip tightened on his rifle, but his voice remained calm and level. "You have no authority here, Phillips. This is my land, legally purchased and registered with the territorial office. You know that as well as I do." Ronald's sneer widened into an ugly grin. "Funny thing about land rights, Gonzalez. Sometimes the paperwork gets lost, or maybe it turns out there were irregularities in the original filing. Makes a man's claim pretty worthless when that happens." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about law enforcement or territorial authority. This was a land grab, pure and simple, with Ronald Phillips using his connections and hired guns to steal what Paul had built through years of hard work and solitude. "And what about the woman?" one of Phillips's men asked, gesturing towards Sarah with his chin. "What do we do about her?" "Bring her along," Ronald said without taking his eyes off Paul. "She might have information about Gonzalez's activities. Besides, we can't leave witnesses behind to tell tales." Paul stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the mounted men. "The woman has nothing to do with this. She's just a housekeeper I hired from town. Let her go back to Cedar Ridge and you can settle whatever business you think you have with me." But Ronald was shaking his head before Paul had finished speaking. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, we've done some checking on your housekeeper here. Turns out she's not quite what she seems to be. Sarah's heart began to pound as Ronald's cold gaze fixed on her. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the malicious satisfaction in his expression made it clear that whatever he had discovered, he intended to use it against both her and Paul. Sarah Ward, Ronald continued, savoring each word like a fine wine, widow of Thomas Ward, who died owing money to some very important people back east. People who have been looking for his wife ever since she disappeared with what remained of their investment. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she had to grip the clothesline to keep from falling. She had thought she had escaped her past when she came west, but apparently her husband's debts had followed her even here. The realization that she had inadvertently brought this danger to Paul's doorstep made her feel sick with guilt and shame. Paul's expression had grown deadly calm as he processed Ronald's words, and Sarah could see him making rapid calculations about their situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a remote location with no hope of immediate rescue. But she also saw something else in his pale eyes, a cold fury that spoke of a man who had been pushed too far and was preparing to push back. "So this was all a setup," Paul said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You arranged for her to come here, used her as bait to get me isolated and vulnerable." Ronald's grin widened. "Partly, though, I have to admit the woman proved more resourceful than we expected. We thought she'd be dead from exposure before she ever reached your cabin. The fact that she survived long enough to walk into one of your traps was just good luck." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. She had been used from the very beginning, manipulated into a situation that was designed to destroy both her and the man who had shown her kindness. The job offer that had brought her west, the convenient death of the Phillips family patriarch, even her getting lost on the trail, all of it had been orchestrated to serve Ronald's purposes. "But why?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking about her own fate or Paul's. "Money, of course," Ronald replied with casual cruelty. "Your late husband's creditors were willing to pay handsomely for information about your whereabouts, and Gonzalez here has been sitting on some of the richest mineral deposits in the territory without even knowing it. Kill two birds with one stone, you might say." Paul raised his rifle with fluid grace, the barrel centering on Ronald's chest. "You made one mistake, Phillips. You assumed I'd go quietly." The tension in the clearing ratcheted up to a breaking point as both sides prepared for violence. Sarah could see the hired guns reaching for their weapons, could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge between life and death. Then, just as it seemed the shooting would begin, a new voice cut through the cold mountain air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, boys." Christopher Sanders emerged from the tree line behind Ronald's men, his own rifle trained on the group with rock-steady hands. Behind him came two other men Sarah didn't recognize, both armed and clearly allied with Christopher and Paul. The odds had suddenly shifted dramatically, and Ronald's confident sneer began to fade as he realized his advantage had evaporated. "Now then," Christopher said conversationally, "seems to me you fellows are trespassing on private property. Might be best if you turned those horses around and headed back to town before someone gets hurt." The standoff lasted for several more tense seconds before Ronald finally signaled his men to lower their weapons. He was outnumbered now, and whatever authority he claimed to represent wouldn't protect him if shooting started. But his eyes promised that this confrontation was far from over as he wheeled his horse around to leave. "This isn't finished, Gonzalez," he called over his shoulder. "You can't hide up here forever, and when you come down to town, I'll be waiting." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the forest, Sarah found herself shaking with reaction to the violence that had been narrowly averted. Paul lowered his rifle and moved to her side, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he helped steady her. "It's over," he said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't really true. Ronald Phillips would be back, probably with more men and a better plan. The sanctuary that Paul had built in these mountains was no longer safe for either of them, but as Sarah looked into Paul's eyes, she saw something that gave her hope despite the danger they faced. The cold, distant man who had found her in his trap had been replaced by someone who cared about her welfare, who was willing to risk his life to protect her from the consequences of a past she couldn't escape. "What happens now?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Paul was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the pale winter light. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth she had never heard from him before. Now we figure out how to build a life together, despite everything that's trying to tear us apart. If you're willing to take that risk with a man like me, Sarah smiled through her tears, understanding that she had found something in these mountains that she had never expected to discover. Not just safety or employment, but a connection with another human being who understood what it meant to be alone in the world and was willing to stand against that loneliness together. I think I've been taking risks with you since the moment I stepped into that trap, she said. What's one more? As the winter wind whispered through the pine trees around them, Sarah Ward and Paul Gonzalez began to plan not just their survival, but their future together in a world that had tried its best to destroy them both. They had found each other in the wilderness, two lost souls who had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous gamble is also the one most worth taking.